Today's reading from Hebrews, as we wrap up Hebrews, is a lengthy reading. If you have a Bible with you, or if you're so techie that you've got a Bible app on your phone or your iPad and you have that with you, I invite you to bring up Hebrews chapter 11 and 12, because we'll take a look at a few more verses than this in the message today. But for now, we're going to read from chapter 11 and 12. It says this: "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this he received approval as righteous, God himself giving approval to his gifts. He died, but through his faith he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For it was attested before he was taken away that he pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever would approach him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith Noah, warned by God about events as yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that is in accordance with faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of that same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. And moving ahead to chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For who the sake of the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God." This is God's story, our story. Thanks be to God. So today we wrap up our Hebrews series, this Picture This series. What does God look like? We see Ben makes him look like what a 3 or 4-year-old might see God as, right? How do we picture God? In this, we've pictured how God looks, who God is. Today, we picture what God is calling us to. So Hebrews 11 today gives us a very simple definition of faith. Something I think it's important for us to reflect upon. What is faith? Well, it's being sure of our hopes and certain of things that we do not see. Very simple definition. And then after that, chapter 11 becomes this litany, this list of heroes of faith that the author of Hebrews thinks that his intended recipients are going to be able to resonate with. People whose stories that we know. In this chapter 11, we read of 12 different instances, just a few of them in our reading today that we read out loud. But like I said, if you're looking at Scripture, you see in chapter 11 there are 12 different either people or groups of people that this author lifts up as champions of faith. Stories that we know so well, stories like Noah, and in seemingly a lunacy builds an ark by faith. We see Abraham leave a land, even willing to sacrifice his son, the son that he longed so much for. We see him do these by faith. We see stories over and over again in this chapter that to the point of, verse 32 in chapter 11, where the author finally says, you know what, I could keep going on and on about Samson, about David, about the prophets. There are so many stories to be told that we could be here all day long just recounting these stories. That there isn't enough room in that chapter for all of these stories of faith. By faith, these men and women acted in faith to God. Real stories, real people of faith. And all of this in chapter 11 almost becomes a prelude to what we find in chapter 12. For you English majors or teachers out there, the word we see in chapter 12 is therefore. Because we are surrounded. Therefore, I think it's a conjunctive adverb. If you take nothing from today, you'll remember that. Therefore is a conjunctive adverb. It's meant to tie what all that is said in chapter 11, this list and litany of people acting by faith, to these first couple of verses in chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat at the right hand of the throne of God. So what do we find in these two verses? All of this litany and list of people of faith build up to these two verses in chapter 12. And what do we find in these two verses in chapter 12? A lot. I'm sure some of you know these verses, maybe even by heart. And to be honest, we could spend an entire, not just a day, but an entire series just on these two verses in Hebrew, unpacking them, taking a look and saying, what does it mean for us to live as Hebrews chapter 12 people of faith? And as I prepped for today, I thought there were three main things that stuck out to me. Now, the first one is this, that we have a race to run, a journey specific to each of us. If you're filling out your bulletin, jot this down. We have a race to run, or as I paraphrase it, a journey specific to each of us. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are or have ever been runners. If you've ever done a 5K before, or a half marathon or a marathon, or you've done a charity walk. Next weekend when we do that Outreach for Hope bike ride, very much like a race, because there is a set path for us on that race or at that race. If you've done one of these before, you know there are people pointing you in the direction you've got to go to keep you on the path that's been designated for that race. There are signs, there are markers, there are cones. It's a guide along the way, keeping us on our race path. And it's this imagery, this idea of a race, that I think resonates so much with me. An analogy that this author of Hebrews that's presented us, speaking to our lives, recognizing the fact that each of us are on this path. Regardless of whether or not we've chosen it, God has placed us somewhere in our own path, in our own journey, and one that I think as a person of faith is specific to us. That God has a path that He chooses for us. And He gives us signs and guides and people pointing us to our path along the way. The second thing that this Hebrews author at least speaks to me in is in verse 1 of chapter 12. Tells us that we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. In our race that we're running, that we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, realizing very succinctly we're not alone in this journey, this path, this race that God has called us to. So in chapter 11, it's this litany, this list of acts that have been done by faith, this cloud of witnesses that have carried on this torch of faith. And it makes me think about not only these biblical heroes that I relate to, but also the people in my life that are present now or have been in the past that have been part of this cloud of witnesses, that have walked with me, that have encouraged me and pointed me along the way. And as I started thinking about it, and I realized, 36 years old isn't that old, but it's not young anymore. Right? Maybe some of you think 36 is really young. It doesn't feel so young, especially with a 6-week-old at home. I'm realizing this cloud of witnesses is becoming not only what's this cloud of witnesses that has surrounded me, but even more so, whose cloud am I a witness to? Whose life am I in that I'm encouraging them along the way? I wonder if you think about this cloud of witnesses in your life, who's present, but then reflect on whose cloud are you in too. The third point I want to lift up from Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, is we are running a race, and it's in faith. That it's not of our own impetus, that God is equipping us for this race and giving us bread for the journey. You know, Greg has lifted up a couple of times in our sermon series on Hebrews that Jesus being this pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And I think when we look to this idea of a race, when we look to models to follow, my dad's a marathon runner, and he's run probably, I think at this point, 15 marathons, maybe. Pretty serious. But I remember when he started, he found a book on how to prepare to run a marathon. And it was like a day by day or week by week for 6 or 8 months leading up to that day of the race. And it never crossed my mind that it's something you have to be pretty intentional in preparing for, a marathon. 26 miles, it's a long way to go. Now, we as Christians, we have this great cloud of witnesses that has encouraged us in our faith, but also, if we're looking for a book that helps us with our race, we have nothing better to turn to than Scripture itself. And when we look at Jesus and the life that he lived here on earth, we have the perfect model for running our race. We've got the blueprint for what it means to be a race runner of faith. So as this theme of running has crossed my mind over and over again for the last couple of weeks, running a race of faith, I've had a tune in my head kind of for the last couple of weeks in preparing, and it's the Chariots of Fire theme. Dun, 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 dun. So Chariots of Fire, if you're not familiar with it, it's a movie from 1981. It actually won the Academy Award in '82 for Best Picture. And it tells the story of two runners, Harold Abrahams and Eric Liddell, and their journey in preparing in England for the 1924 Olympics in Paris. It's an incredible movie. You know, that the theme song was written for that movie. I think it actually won an Academy Award for Best Original Composition for movies that year as well. If you've seen that iconic opening picture of those guys running on the beach in the sand, right in front of St. Andrews, actually, in Scotland. There they are running. And so I've had this imagery and picture in my mind of running the race with that song in my head. And as if you've seen the movie, it's a fantastic movie. And I really resonate with the story of Eric Liddell. Now, he was a devout Christian. And so much so that as he prepared for the Olympics, he did not practice on Sundays on the Sabbath. But when he found out the schedule for the Olympics, he found that his best event, the 100 meters, would be scheduled on a Sunday. And he decided not to run his best event because he was so committed to his faith, so devout and committed to Christ, that he felt like he couldn't run on the Sabbath day. Now, he did go on to win a gold medal, I think, in the 400, a bronze medal in the 200, but his best event, that 100 meters, he sat out. At some point, his sister questioned his commitment to God because she was as devout, if not more devout, committed to her faith as her brother. And so she questions him, and his response was this: I believe that God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Eric would spend his life after running 21 more years of his life. It's a short life. He lived to be in his 40s. He would spend the rest of his life as a missionary in China, helping this Civil War-ravaged country repair itself. And he cared for many, many men and women that mourned his death. As they say, where the rubber meets the road, where does the rubber meet the road for us? Where's our race? Where's our path, our journey taking us? Today, it's easy to see in these verses from Hebrews, we get that gospel proclamation of that we are not alone in this race, that we have this cloud of witnesses, that we have a model for our race in the form of Jesus Christ. But what it doesn't tell us is where our specific journey, our race, is leading us. I'm not sure where you feel like God has led you on your journey of faith, if you felt led at all in this race. I don't think our lives, the things that happen in them, are just by happenstance. I think that God equips us and prepares us specifically for the race that's set before us. And he calls us to be hands and feet of his love in this world along this journey of faith, along this race. Today, I hope that you're considering, where's the next stop in this journey? Where's the next turn, the next curve, the next uphill or downhill part of the race? And when I get to it, am I ready for it? So I was thinking about this race and personally where I have been led from Kentucky to the Northwest United States, Boise to Baltimore to Milwaukee area. And along the way, the people I've encountered on this race, this journey of faith, I definitely feel a sense of God's presence, God's call along the way. And I hope in your life you felt that same call to run as well. I'm not sure what lies ahead for you. It might be, we talk about the big corporate things we have going on here at Atonement, things from God's Work Our Hands Sunday to the LeGros fundraiser, a family that's not members of our church, but is connected to our church. And we found it appropriate to support them and care for them and love them just as we would love one of our own. So we're supporting them with a fundraiser. You can read about that in your At One Weekly. Maybe it's the one of these kinds of things. The Outreach for Hope bike ride next weekend that we've got, 12 folks lined up for. Where the most we've ever had before, I think, is 6. It's great. Maybe it's something less corporate. Maybe it's being there for a friend in need, praying for someone you know could use it, writing a note of encouragement to someone. Maybe it's being a voice of reason in a world that is marred with violence, with division. I have to tell you this week, when I saw the picture of that Syrian boy that had washed ashore, as he was trying to escape from division and war in his own country, and realizing his dad had to watch his wife and his 2 sons die, and trying to escape, it made me want to be involved in that process. Of when people are looking for refuge, we have to help. Maybe that's one of the next turns in my life, or in yours. I can't tell you where your path is leading, but I can tell you you're on one. And you can choose this path that God has set before you. You can choose your own path. Regardless of which way, God's going to be present with you. God will love you. But God has something clearly marked out for each of us. Later in life, when he was living as a missionary in China, Eric Liddell was asked if he regretted giving up the fame of running by a reporter. And Eric had a simple answer, and he answered it this way. It's natural for a chap to think over all that sometimes. But I'm glad I'm at the work I'm engaged in now. A fellow's life counts for far more at this than the other.